we're on to our final panel, last but certainly not least. It's an amazingly brilliant panel. I'm really excited by it. It's got some real senior people on it, and I think you're in for a bit of a treat. So it's going to be moderated by Geoff Mackey, Group Corporate Affairs and Sustainability Director for BASF, and it's called Sustainability and Reducing Scope 1 and 2 Emissions, How to Deliver on the Circular Economy. So over to you, Geoff.
Adam, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the segue. That makes sure I've got nothing to say to start off the conversation. It's a real pleasure to be with an excellent panel today. And what I'd like to do to start with is to give the panel a few moments individually to introduce themselves. First and foremost, everyone's smiling and nervously, which is always a good starting point. I'm going to start in the order of my list rather than the order on screen, if I may. So, Bob, could you just introduce who you are, your organization and role, please?
Sure. So I'm Bob Maughon. I'm the EVP for Technology, Sustainability, and Innovation at Sabic, as well as the CTO and CSO at Sabic. Sabic is a global petrochemical company, so we're very focused on, in this dialogue here today on how to drive emissions within our footprint. So prior to joining Sabic, I spent 20 years in R&D at Dow Chemical.
Thank you very much, Bob. Simon, the same question to start us off, please.
Oh, thanks very much, Geoff. I'm Simon Flowers. I'm Chief Analyst and Chairman at Mackenzie. If you don't know us, we're a research and consultancy business that covers everything in energy and metals and mining to boot. That's me. I've been here for about 30 years plus and had personal experience in metals and mining as well as the energy industry. Back to you, Geoff.
Fantastic, thank you. Bryan, who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do?
Okay, I'm Bryan Glover. I'm the president and CEO of Honeywell UOP, which, for any of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a 100-plus-year-old company that's historically been the largest provider of technology in the refining and petrochemical space. So we're primarily a licensor, catalyst, adsorbent supplier, equipment supplier. A lot of our history has been in the hydrocarbon space and in energy and in petrochemicals. But increasingly today, we're offering a lot of technology and a lot of new opportunities around sustainability and reduction of carbon impact of the assets that people have. And as part of the broader Honeywell, that's increasingly the mission of Honeywell overall, is to help the world transition to a more sustainable tomorrow. I'm a 36-year veteran of UOP, spent, like Bob before me, spent the majority of my career actually in R&D. I spent about 20 years in R&D here working on everything from catalyst to process development around a range of technologies.
Thanks very much, Bryan. We haven't got high-resolution cameras. We'd never have guessed the depth and breadth of the experience just from looking at the smiling face. Nicola, on to you next, please.
Well, Geoff, you've got me nervous about what you're going to say about me when I've finished. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nicola Knight. I head up the Advisian Decarbonisation team. Advisian is the consulting business of Worley, the global EPC company. So a little bit about myself. I'm a chemical engineer, started off life many years ago, not quite as many as Bryan, but getting there at Esso at the Fawley refinery here in the UK. And for most of my career, I've been helping clients globally to identify and implement sustainable energy efficiency solutions. And of course, sustainable energy efficiency is the first step on that energy transition journey and that decarbonisation journey, because you need to be operating your assets, designing your assets for those optimum levels of energy efficiency in order to be on the right track for reducing your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So very much looking forward to the panel. Back to you, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And just to complete the range of introductions, Chris, if you'd be so good.
Thank you, Geoff, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yes, so I'm Chris Manson-Whitton, one of the directors from Progressive Energy. Progressive Energy is a project development company. We are based here in the UK. We're around 35 people, and our mission has always been to take material quantities of CO2 out of our energy system. We've been doing that since 1998 with a strong focus on carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. And we achieve what we're doing by building consortia. So we're a small company, but then we work with large multinationals to deliver projects. And we are the architects of the Highnet Industrial Decarbonisation Cluster here in the UK. I will tell you a little bit about that a little bit later, but it's been selected as one of the 2 leading industrial decarbonisation clusters here in the UK. So many thanks, Geoff, and back over to you.
Chris, thank you very much. And I'm Geoff Mackey. I work within BASF. We're a global chemicals and technology conglomerate, and I do corporate affairs and sustainability, which means that I drink tea with interesting people. Our topic for today for the panel is sustainability and reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions, how to deliver on the circular economy. And what I'd like to do is for each of the panel to take a few minutes and just set their stall out for the topic before we move on to any specifics. Simon, would you mind if I start off with you, please? Sustainability and reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Well, look, I'll be delighted to kick off. So, first of all, Woodmac really believes in the circular economy. We've done a lot of work on it. We don't think it's a utopia. It is realizable, but let's face it, there's a very long way to go. But it's going to be necessary to the sustainability of refining, that's for sure. And the challenge is how we get there. And I think it's in refining, it's about the whole value chain from feedstocks to refining operations, and eventually the products that come out of the refinery as well, beyond scope 1 and scope 2. And I think lastly, it's about how refineries fit into the broader industry and economy, and refiners develop partnerships to maximize the chances of the industry, but also each country achieving net zero. That's all from me, Geoff.
Thank you very much. A really interesting start. You've already started out by mentioning the word beyond our agenda, and I think that's another of the conversations worth exploring. Chris, moving on to you, would you like to grasp this one firmly?
Thank you, Geoff. Yes, so maybe if I can just wind up, and I think I'll use the UK as a bit of an example as a case study, and then I'll move on to Highnet as well. So if we think about our energy system, thinking about it here in the UK, our focus historically has been on decarbonising electricity. But actually, when you look at our total energy consumption here in the UK, in round numbers, it's about 1 billion barrels of oil equivalent. But our electricity consumption is less than 200 million barrels of oil equivalent, so less than 20%. And actually over 300 million barrels is gas, and over 500 million barrels are petroleum-based products. So when we're looking at where our carbon is coming from in our society, we really need to start thinking about those, because we are world leading in offshore wind, for example. We really are, and we've got some fantastic goals that we're looking to hit by 2030. But in reality, at the moment, it only makes up around 10% of our electricity demand, and therefore only about 2% of our total energy flow. So even if we multiply that up by 4 or 5, which is the ambition that we've got here in the UK, that's still actually only a small proportion of our total energy flows. And sure, we'll make a very big difference to our current electricity demand, but how are we going to make a difference to that other 80% that we need to dig deep into? And I think we've just got to recognise that fossil resources are a really important part of the transition on our journey to 2050, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about that. We need to be able to use those fossil resources, but of course the challenge is, how do we do that in a way that doesn't contribute to global heating? And in reality, we've got 2 main tools there. Either when we burn our fossil resources, we take CO2 out, we capture it and store it, or we take our fossil resources, convert them into an energy vector that has no carbon in it centrally, do that, produce low carbon hydrogen, so you've not got any carbon with your final product, and then you use the efficiencies, economies of scale in that capture process to then deliver a high value product out to customers ultimately. And in reality, we need a mixture of both. Now, here in the UK, we've got a lot of coastline for the amount of area that we've got. So actually, we're really well placed in terms of geography, geology, and we've got the infrastructure, we've got the skills. So that really sets us up well. So if I just touch briefly on Highnet, so that is an industrial decarbonisation cluster we've been working on for over 5 years. We conceived it, and as I said earlier, now being selected as a decarbonisation cluster. And based on the premise I've talked about, we're looking to take 10 million tonnes of CO2 out of our energy system in the Northwest by 2030. Or to put it in another way, we're looking to take almost 50% of the natural gas off the system and replace that with hydrogen. And it's about how we transition, how we use our fossil fuels responsibly. And of course, the other side of it is where are our customers? Where are the end users? So we've got over 40 users of that infrastructure, some directly capturing CO2, but over 30 industrial users, big household international names, whether we're talking Unilever, Pilkington, Heinz, PepsiCo, Jaguar Land Rover, big companies who've said, we want hydrogen to help us decarbonise. So that's what we're doing. We're working in partnership with Essar, the refinery in Stanlow, through a joint venture that we've got called Vertex to produce the hydrogen. And then if I just anchor it back into refineries, so downstream, that's what we're here today, is I guess there's two aspects. One, a refinery like Stanlow emits over 2 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. Those scope 1 and 2 emissions we're talking about, through a combination of CO2 capture and storage and hydrogen fuel switching, they're looking to be net zero by 2030. So on the one hand, it's decarbonising their processes, but of course the other really interesting thing is actually transitioning the products they make from high carbon products, liquid hydrocarbons, through to hydrogen. So then you're talking about a low carbon, high value product ultimately that then becomes the transition product from our refineries. So we go, Geoff. A few thoughts from me.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's a great positioner. Bryan, Chris talked about the UK as an exemplar. From your perspective, where do we start with sustainability and scope 1 and 2 emission reduction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that at the end of the day, that really is the question. And Chris touched on this, and I think there's multiple steps here. The first step is, and Chris got into this a little bit, is separating the concept of primary energy from energy delivery and consumption. And so I think the first thing we need to do, both globally and regionally, for anyone that's going on this journey, is understand where primary energy, or where their primary energy needs to come from. And in many cases, it will be fossil resources through a transition. And then think about how we get to the most efficient energy consumption and delivery based on the primary energy that's available, right? I think we all know it doesn't make sense to move quickly to energy delivery and consumption mechanisms that rely on maybe some of the most CO2 emitting fossil resources. So we have to be careful about how we make that transition. And then I think it's for everyone to look at in as capital intensive an industry as the downstream industry is, how do we take best advantage of existing resources and existing capabilities globally in order to meet the challenge? So the solution in the UK may be very different than the solution in Germany, may be very different than the solution in Singapore or the US. And I think that's from the perspective of UOP, that's really the way we've looked at this problem is, how can we provide to our traditional customer base and other customers a range of solutions that can be deployed directly to address the challenges they have, the primary energy sources that are available to them today and through transition, and some of the mechanisms for transmission and then consumption of the energy. So that may be everything from hydrogen, which could take the form of blue to green, depending on availability of natural gas and suitability of sequestration, availability of renewable electricity. Looking at pivots from, as Chris had mentioned, pivots from fuels to petrochemicals and refining, essentially, reducing scope 3 while working on scope 1 and scope 2, to better solutions for energy storage to support renewable power generation, to renewable fuels and renewable petrochemicals, either from renewable feedstocks or also introducing circularity into those chains. So there's a whole range of approaches. I think for each situation and for each facility, there will be a somewhat unique solution. That's really been the nature of this industry for more than 100 years. When you look at refineries and petrochemical plants, to a certain extent, they're all unique in how they're configured. And I think the solution for them all will be unique, and will really rely on a range of technologies to provide that solution. But the great news is it's an industry that's demonstrated for over 100 years a high level of creativity.
Bryan, thank you very much. Positivism moving forward. Bob, could we just pick this one up from a Sabic perspective? How are you looking to grasp this one going forward with sustainability and reducing emissions?
Yeah, look, I think great perspectives from all the panelists on this, and I think if I take it maybe to a petrochemical player and give a perspective, I think it's important to sort of have a baseline understanding. I think as Bryan said, this is going to be very complicated, and asset by asset there may be different solutions, but in reality, I think it's important to step back and go, okay, what drives carbon emissions for the industry? And if you look at carbon emissions, the industrial sector accounts for about a quarter of global carbon emissions, and in that, in terms of energy consumption, the petrochemical industry is the largest consumer of energy versus iron, steel, and cement. But when it comes to carbon emissions, they're the lowest of those three. So that's kind of an interesting observation. And why is that the case? And I think it was touched on by some of the discussion here, but that's because part of the petrochemical feedstock goes into the end product at the end of the day. So, the other part is the energy used to drive the reactions. And I think, one number that often surprises a lot of people is that when you look at carbon emissions for the petrochemical sector and you look at scope 1 emissions, over 85% of those emissions are a result simply of the heat used to drive reaction. So although it's a very complicated issue, the driver is actually pretty straightforward. The driver is, how do you address heat in petrochemical processing in a way that can deliver you a low carbon solution? And so that's how we approach the problem as a petrochemical player like Sabic. Like many of our peers, we're located in regions around the world. And to Bryan's point, you have to think about how do you address that heat issue in a way that's consistent with the available resources and opportunities in each of the regions. And so for us, we'll get into this in the dialogue, but we've laid out a very clear roadmap. We gave thanks to support from our CEO, accountability to all of our businesses to deliver a carbon neutrality roadmap for 2050. And by doing that and giving them ownership and accountability, and bringing technology solutions in to help develop that roadmap, we're able to come with a very clear plan. At the end of the day, when you look at the path to driving towards carbon neutrality, for us on scope 1 and 2, it's obviously about reliability on our assets. I think this overall engagement in this whole conference is good because digital will play a key role in driving efficiency and reliability in operations and driving improvements in overall energy efficiency. But that's really only going to deliver about 20% of the solution for us. It's going to require a significant uptick in renewable electricity. It's going to require us to leverage that not just for our scope 2 emissions, but also for electrification of our assets. It's going to require us to leverage hydrogen, as well highlighted by the panel. And I think an important question that we'll get into is the role of petrochemicals in that journey in blue hydrogen as well as in green, and how that transition will play itself out. Because I think short term you're going to see obviously a focus on blue, but long term you're going to clearly see the cost competitiveness of green, and how do we balance strategically the choices we make on that front. And of course, carbon capture plays a critical role, not only in the blue hydrogen production, but also in looking at how we can directly capture carbon from our assets. So, I think we look at it holistically as a journey that requires us in each region to understand carbon capture capability, understand access to renewables, understand the role that petrochemicals will play in ensuring that we have a strategy that not only works globally, but that we can take tactically in each region to drive our roadmaps.
Bob, thank you very much. A whole series of themes there. Nicola, the one thing that has been mentioned several times, which I think you might like to take as part of your starting point, is the conversation around transition when we talk about sustainability.
Yeah.
What are you grasping on that one? How do we move forward?
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is maybe share some of the experiences we've had over the last couple of years where we've been helping clients, oil and gas clients globally, to decarbonise. We've been preparing 2025, 2030, 2040 roadmaps, quite detailed step-by-step activities of what the refinery or the chemical plant can do to meet their net zero targets. So I'll share some of the lessons learned from that, and I think it touches very nicely on some of the points that the other panelists have been making. So I think in the short term, it's about identifying the right mix of projects to meet the decarbonisation targets. And of course, every refinery, depending on where they are, has a different decarbonisation target. Chris, you mentioned SR with their 2030 net zero. We've got other refineries that are striving for a 10% reduction in scope 1 and 2 by 2030, or a 30% reduction. So every refinery has a different set of targets that they're trying to achieve. And I think in the short term, for the majority, it's about finding the right mix of targets, the right mix of projects to meet those targets, rather than eliminating the CO2. And identifying that right mix requires you to identify the breakpoint between saving energy, reducing scope 1 and 2 by saving energy, and CO2 abatement. And one of the key factors that we can see at this breakpoint is the utility system constraint. So nothing very exciting. The steam and power and fuel gas system, what's the constraint in those supporting systems at the refinery or petrochemical plant, which makes saving energy become less attractive, and then you need to move on to to CO2 abatement. And a very simple example, just to get the point over, is would you put post-combustion carbon capture on a thermally inefficient furnace, or do you size that carbon capture for the as-is operation, or do you improve the base case first? They're the sort of discussions and practical day-to-day realities that clients are having to face, and decisions they're having to face. And what we've been saying in Advisian for the last couple of years is that it's a different solution for every site. And Bryan, you made this point. It's absolutely true. And the more sites I work on, the more evident it is that there really is a different solution for every site. It depends on the process unit configuration, utility system configuration, the feedstocks, the current level of energy efficiency. And when I talk about energy efficiency in this point, I mean, how well heat integration, pinch analysis have been applied, how well designed the process units are, the furnaces, the heat exchangers, all those types of energy efficiency activities, which have been known about for many years. Nothing new there. Some of the other factors that make a difference for the refinery is access to renewable electricity, proximity of CO2 storage, whether onshore, offshore, available plot plan space. Some of these refineries have been extended over the years. There's limited plot space, and we need to find the room to install the new equipment. And then the cluster approach. Are there neighbouring industries that they can join with in order to share heat? Somebody at waste stream is another person's feed stream, all these different aspects that need to be taken into account, and many more, the local regulations, the availability of bio feedstock. The list is endless, but it's all about finding the right solution for your assets. And to find that right solution, you need the right business case. You need a robust business case, so that your marginal abatement cost curve, the nice diagram that you can put together showing how you're going to reduce your tons of CO2 is accurate. And the key to that is CapEx, having realistic CapEx for your solutions in order to come up with the right MAC curve. And of course, some of the solutions we're talking about are new technologies, and so you need to understand the technology readiness level and be able to make a decision about capex in the future, because refineries are doing their 2030, 2040 roadmaps. So we need to try and predict what the capex will be, take into account the future learnings and we expect to see in the new technologies. And so that sort of brings me back to my favourite topic of utility systems. And when we're talking about integrating new units, the biofuels or green hydrogen, carbon capture into the existing brownfield site, they all impact the utility system. So modelling, understanding the constraints of that over the future roadmap time period are really key to develop that holistic, sustainable and executable scope 1 and scope 2 roadmap reduction, and ultimately aim for your net zero target. So there's some thoughts from me based on some of the projects we've been working on globally.
That's a fabulous introduction to some of the thoughts and themes that we'll take hold of as part of this panel. I'm also slightly outraged that you suggest that long-term planning is required. Those of us in and around politics in the UK know that's completely overrated as a concept. One of the things we do need to grasp, of course, and Nicola, you talked about prioritization, the question of where we start. I mean, this is another part of this. Bob, within Sabic, where do you actually start looking at pilots at scale, and how can you actually bring those themes together?
Yeah, look, I think it's important in this journey, right? Because it can seem like such a huge undertaking. I think is highlighted by many of the panelists. You can sort of get lost on this key question of how to start. And I think, for us, when we laid out our 2050 roadmaps, we also very clearly laid out what our path to 2030 was. And I think an interesting discussion that we'll have here is that roadmap to 2030 is very different than what our 2030 to 2050 roadmap looks like in terms of what technologies, what approaches it takes. And so I think you have to run parallel paths. You have to tackle the things that you can implement today, and you have to invest now in the technologies that you see are going to be enabling for that second phase of the transition. If you just take an example of Sabic and you look at the 2030 targets, we have a target to reduce emissions by 20% versus our 2018 baseline. And that's going to come primarily from renewable energy purchase, which is going to help address, obviously, directly our scope 2 emissions, some direct electrification of our assets, where we can leverage that in some of the downstream operations, which will also drive more efficiency in our performance. It's going to come through greater digitalization in our assets and more efficiency drive in our projects. And those are all funded initiatives. And it's going to come through the leverage of hydrogen and carbon capture. And, in that case, we have, clear projects on all those fronts, on the carbon capture side, clear investments in Saudi Arabia ongoing with their initial capacity of carbon capture that will help us hit our 2030 targets. Clear investments in renewable energy capacity in Europe and Saudi Arabia as well, and now moving forward globally. So I think those are the actionable things, right? We can take real steps, develop a pipeline that can deliver the reduction for 2030. But the reality is that's not the most efficient path to hitting the 2050 targets. And when it comes to building business cases and building reliable portfolio solutions, we have to also invest in technologies that can significantly improve the cost position of those paths. So in parallel to those initiatives that I just highlighted, we have invested in new technology areas, whether that be in hydrogen or in electrification. And I think a great example of where we've taken a step is we're partnering with BASF and Linde on electrification of our crackers. That technology path is well underway with all three parties, with a pilot plant in development in the BASF site that hopefully will be operational in 2024. But that will allow us to demonstrate at scale with a multi-megawatt facility how to electrify a furnace, which will allow us to move away from using natural gas to fire our furnaces. But we have to recognize that path to demonstrate that and then scale that to a full-fledged implementation is going to take time, and it's going to be a bigger part of the 2030 to 2050 roadmap. So it's key to do it now. It's key to do it now and invest, to take capital risks, to work with partners that we think can also scale it. And, I think one of the benefits of the partnership with Linde as well is that also can leverage that solution out to the market. So I think what's important is to not get caught in this sort of grand challenge and not knowing where to start. I think you have to take tangible steps, which are actually pretty clear today with technology offerings as they exist. But to make sure that you're investing for the long term, whether it's in new petrochemical processes, new routes, and new products in the portfolio, and advancing, the cost of other solutions, whether it be in the production of hydrogen or carbon capture. So that's how we're approaching it as a company. But again, part of that really requires a much greater collaboration, not just within our industry, but within the broader value chain than we're maybe used to in the past. And I think you're going to see more examples. I think, our collaboration with BASF is one example, but you're going to see many more like this because it's going to be essential to de-risking these investments and also ensuring that they can have widespread adoption.
Thanks very much, Bob. Bryan, Bob's just brought in the whole question of prioritization, technology, and time to work these projects through. From your perspective, how does that technology application start moving forward and adding value?
Yeah, well, I think I'll start off by saying I think Bob addressed it actually quite well and very succinctly in terms of the outlook that needs to be taken. It is a multi-horizon outlook, and it's a matter of looking what can be done today and what can be done in a way that it remains accretive long term, right? So I think it was mentioned earlier, you don't want to solve a problem that's going to go away by putting carbon capture, for instance, on a low efficiency heater. And so it's really looking at taking what Bob said a little bit further, a little bit deeper, starting to build that pathway, building that roadmap through, an abatement curve or something like that recognizes what's available today and the short-term goals of any operation, as well as the long-term goals and what might be multiple pathways. If you start to look at the second horizon or the third, and we start making as an industry those bets on technology, we need to make multiple bets because some, we know historically, some are going to turn out better than others. So we need to be looking at the future through multiple pathways. But we find in dealing with our customers today, our traditional customer base, that often the first steps, the lowest hanging fruit, often can add profitability that can help underwrite some of those solutions going forward. So when we look at typical refinery operations today, some of the easiest steps can be in, improvement of energy efficiency, where there's a little bit of capex versus opex pay, trade-off. Generally, we're seeing with customers the threshold for those investments getting a little bit higher and recognizing that these are not just cost savings, but these are longer-term investments in the viability and the decarbonation path that they want to go on. So they're willing to spend a little bit more because it'll pay back in the future. Initial pivots to petrochemicals, increasing propylene production, incremental production of aromatics, either benzene or xylenes, either in a raw or purified form, or some specialty petrochemicals along the way, butylenes and butylene derivatives, can add a lot of value, even with a relatively small incremental step, and start that journey in a profitable way, so that you increase profits and set yourself up for other long-term journeys. In terms of decarbonization, for many refineries, the most direct step, if there's availability of carbon sequestration, is carbon capture off of existing hydrogen-producing assets, particularly steam methane reformers. They can represent anywhere from 20 to 30% of the total CO2 emissions from a refinery. And technology is available today to do that at a relatively low cost, right? It's not today it doesn't necessarily increase profitability, but the cost is relatively low. And in many regions, there's governmental incentives that can largely offset the cost of that recovery and the cost of that sequestration. Capture of CO2 today from pre-combustion and post-combustion sources can be actually in the range of $20 to $30 a ton, which, while it isn't free, is considerably less expensive than it was a few years ago. And even in areas like steam methane reforming, when we look at that, we've got solutions available that not only capture the CO2, but also incrementally increase the amount of hydrogen they produce, which I think solutions like that more broadly in the industry are going to help, where it's not just abatement, but it's abatement plus some other improvement in operational performance. So I think that's really the key long term, is looking at the short term, looking at the long term, looking at the range of opportunities in the long term, and starting today, starting the journey today. And I think Bob mentioned that as well. Getting started on the no regret things that will pay off today and pay off going forward. Certainly, a pivot to petrochemicals is a little bit of a first mover play. You know, the entire fuels landscape can't turn to petrochemicals over the next 20, 30 years, but certainly people that start that journey early will be well positioned to complete the journey as they go forward. And we'll see other technologies come into the space that can help in other ways, bring costs down, bring other energy delivery sources to us. Electrification will continue to be a play here, although it's worth noting that the density of energy delivery through natural gas into a facility is highly efficient relative to electrification provides a significant challenge. Certainly facilities are going to go that way, but we bring an awful lot of energy into facilities today through natural gas. So either pre or post combustion approaches to decarbonizing natural gas, I think, are going to be an important vector here too.
Bryan, thank you very much. Nicola,
Geoff,
there isn't...
Geoff, if I could just make a comment on Bryan. Yeah, I just want to to build up Bryan's point, because I think he summarized a lot of those points really well. I think just to make that point, when we look at carbon capture today, it has to be clearly driven by, from a prioritization standpoint, where to do it, where it makes sense. And just building off that, I mean, the reforming side, if we look at our portfolio, whether it's the ammonia, methanol chain, those pieces, that's the clear place where you focus carbon capture today. So just, fully aligned with Bryan's comments. I think we have to stop talking about these broad things like hydrogen and carbon capture, and talk about, like, where can you do it today, where the economics make sense, and actually it can even drive more efficiency in your operation. So just wanted to affirm, very aligned with Bryan's view of that. And I think it's important that we start talking that way versus, we're going to do carbon capture on the back end of a furnace, out of an ethane cracker. That's a little bit more of a challenge, but we can immediately move on some of these things.
Absolutely. And I think this is the other conversation we're looking to have. Nicola, lots and lots of options, lots of questions. Prioritization, what comes first? Where do we spend our money?
Yeah, and it's a challenge, and the key thing is to really define the business case for each of those options, and understand how they interact, and the impact that the impact of one on the other, what impact that has, and then developing robust business case. Having a good capex, having the best estimate of OPEX, and really challenging the team. Is this right? What are we missing? What are we forgetting? How could we add value? How could we monetize this? How could we make it the best business case? And then once you've got all the business case defined, it's easy to do that prioritization. But it's an effort to really develop those robust business cases, because you need to know your starting point. So we know today's operation at a refinery, we know today's feedstock, we know today's products, and we know today's level of energy efficiency. But in the future, the demand side might be different. So we're changing the configuration of the refinery. So there's lots of different variables that are moving. So it's not the refinery today in 2050, how can we decarbonize? It's the refinery in 2050, how do we decarbonize that? And that's that's meeting a different demand. So it's challenging, but it's something we like doing. So
Nicola, thank you very much. The challenge is there, but it's easy because we can all be futurists, Chris. Can you pick that one up and tell us the direction of travel for all of us?
There you go. That's a big question. I mean, I think some really good discussions there about, how do you make those first mover steps, and how do you deal with things in the next few years. But I think we do need to be clear that, first of all, I think Nicola said it very nicely earlier, and Bob, that different places will have different resources. That means that different solutions have to happen in different places. And often we talk about the ideal solution, and that's not right. We talk about What we want is the appropriate solution for a given area. And yes, there will be a role. Clearly, we'll do the efficiency steps, but where do you take it next? Some places may have good access to low cost, low carbon electricity. Well, then that leads them one way. Others, it will be CO2 networks, or it may be hydrogen and hydrogen offtake. Those latter ones are starting to become a wider infrastructure play, not just an individual refinery play. And again, this sort of integration into decarbonisation clusters, providing that critical mass to take things forward. But given it is happening beyond the refinery fence, there is a role for governments in these situations. Some countries are putting a higher price on carbon than others. That's clearly a driver, but then that only works if you've then got sort of ways in which people can't be undercut in their own markets by people providing products where the upstream, carbon emissions matter less. So governments do have a key role. And I think here in the UK, we're very fortunate. We do have the Decarbonisation Cluster Programme, which I certainly know the World Economic Forum see the clusters emerging here as being quite important. So I think that's good. So there is a role for government, a role for business models, but don't underestimate the role for the private sector and the opportunity for the private sector. Those users of, those companies that understand CO2 capture and storage, they create opportunities in some jurisdictions that they can then take into others and build from that. And there is also a real pull from customers. We see it certainly in some of the things we're doing. We've got the largest glass bottling manufacturer in the UK next to the refinery up at Stanley, and their customers are demanding low carbon solutions for the glass bottles they're making. Diageo don't just want to sell low carbon whiskey, they want low carbon whiskey and low carbon bottles. That means the glass manufacturer wants a low carbon solution to making glass. Well, they're looking at a combination of electrification and hydrogen. They want hydrogen. Then you look at the refinery next door and say they produce hydrogen. Then you've actually got to pull all the way through from customer to the behaviours on a specific refinery.
Chris, thank you very much. I'll shy away from any comment about the sustainability of alcohol as part of the conversation. So, Simon, when we're talking about some of these topics, there's some real challenges starting to appear. How do we pick these up to prioritise going forward?
Well, the panelists have done an amazing job at leaving me very little gap on that particular question. But I'd like to offer a few sort of high level views if I can. So, point one is that if we're going to get on a 1.5 degree centigrade pathway, we have to see oil demand fall pretty damn soon. Now, probably many of us at this conference don't believe that we're going to see peak at 100 million barrels per day, which is pretty much where it is today, and decline thereafter. But that's what has to happen. It's going to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. And so what that does, it does help focus the mind on prioritization. I love the comments we had from Nicola and others saying that each refinery will be different. And there'll be some refinery owners who are thinking, well, how do I guarantee I get my return on my investment on decarbonisation and reducing Scope 1 and Scope 2? And it's an absolutely valid point. So I think that the second point I'd say is that capital availability is pretty good. We know companies have been very tight with investment. Capital discipline has affected or been a philosophy not just for IOCs but NOCs as well. So companies are loath to spend much, although they know they have to do this to survive in decarbonisation. But we're in an extraordinary period where integrated companies are making record cash flow. And although it varies across refining regions, refineries are doing incredibly well. It's only been a few weeks that the Russian disruptions affected things, but margins are very high. So there's a lot more optionality, if you like, to invest in many of the things. And I think it'll focus the mind. And my suspicion is that those ones who carry many of the attributes that have been mentioned already, that are in an advantaged geography, close to good markets, and are already quite complex and integrated with petrochemicals, they're the ones that are in the top quartile of profitability. They're the ones that will be investing quickest, investing in most things and experimenting, like was mentioned already. It's a different story if you're in the bottom quartile and you're not sure you're going to be in business in 10 or 15 years.
Simon, can I just take you back and take you on another step? Because we've been talking about prioritization, we've been talking about energy, we've thrown in a whole series of concepts across the panel. Could I just bring in something from our starting point, which was circularity? Where does the circular economy fit into this conversation? And by the way, to all the panel, we're into our last quarter, so I will be nudging people happily to sharpen things up, because we could go on for hours. These are riveting topics for society as a whole. Simon, what do you think?
Well, we have to move to a circular economy. It's far too square at the moment, if you like, and the baby steps, I'd say, are being led by petrochemicals in particular, but even in petrochemicals, and there's much more than recycling about it. The recycling levels are extraordinarily modest at the moment. I think they're around sort of 15%. But as we get to a world where the refiners are complex integrated units closely aligned with petrochemicals, we have the option, we have a better platform, if you like, to move to a circular economy. And I'd like to think, and governments who mentioned already, I'm not sure the industry will solve it itself. I think we're going to need policy to move in that direction, particularly to improve recycling. So maybe some opening comments for others to pick up.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Nicola. At the moment, we've just heard from Simon that the word he used was modest regarding circularity. Would you like to pick that one up and stand your ground?
Yeah, I think for me, the sorts of things that Chris was talking about earlier, getting the refinery integrated with I think you mentioned Pilkington Glass and other companies like that. I think that's really key. And this collaboration outside of the refinery gates is really important. We've had examples in the last couple of years where refineries have maybe a chemical plant or a CHP plant, a combined heat and power next door, and there's no real communication, there's no real connection. And actually we can see straight away the opportunities for all three sites to come together. So I think for me, going forward, collaboration will be the driver for the circular economy in the downstream sector. I think that's a really key area, and we try and encourage collaboration as much as possible.
Fantastic. Chris, we're all in this together. You wanted to make a point.
Well, I think one very specific area is that a huge amount of our energy resource in many countries is in our waste resource streams. And in the old days, we used to just bury it in the ground. We do often quite efficiently combust it to make electricity, quite cleanly do that. But in terms of actually using those carbon and hydrogen molecules that sit in our waste streams, actually rebuilding them back into either hydrocarbons, or indeed building them back into hydrogen using shift reactions and things to actually really maximize the hydrogen we can get out, is a good example of circular economy. And I think refineries being able to do that, you can then take it on even one stage further and say, in making those other products, we will reject some CO2, and some of that CO2 is biogenic in its resources. If we can then capture and store that, then we are actually entering into having these elements of greenhouse gas reductions that we need. Because in reality, we've all said fossil fuels are going to be a huge part during the transition. Yes, we can capture CO2 from some applications, but others we will end up emitting, and we need some things to offset them. And I think refineries have a lot of the skills, capabilities, infrastructure, and particularly where there's CO2 networks, actually a big part to play in getting GGR actually happening as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Bob, Chris was good enough to use the word waste as part of his answer. I wonder, would you like to pick that one up just very gently when we're talking about circularity?
Yeah, no, look, I think if I just go back to Simon, Nicola, and Chris's comments, I think we're all aligned on this point. I mean, if you go back to maybe one of my earlier comments, on the petrochemical sector, as we talked about, half the energy goes in to drive the reactions, half of it ends up in the product at the end of the day. And so we want to maximize the value of that energy input into that product. And so obviously driving recycling rates, whether it be mechanical recycling, advanced recycling solutions, or integrated solutions, is going to be essential to the path that we need to be on, and from a circularity perspective. And I think, for the refinery sector, it's going to be a more complex world going forward. I think you're going to see waste plastic pyrolysis liquids and other materials brought back into those refineries. You're going to see bio oils and other materials going back into those refineries, which lead to more complex operations, but a more circular solution for all of us. It's a key area of focus for us as a company. And for us specifically, it addresses our scope 3 emissions, which isn't necessarily a focus today, but it's a critical piece of our strategy, because whatever we can do to drive efficiency of the waste back into high value products is a clear area of focus and opportunity for us. But it requires not just the technologies for those conversions. It also requires new partnerships. I think, and Nicola hit the partnership and collaboration point. It requires collaboration, for example, upstream on the waste collection and sortation, the waste conversion side. It requires collaboration downstream on the brand owners, who are typically the ones that are setting the value on those products. And I can just give an example for us where, we've been on the market since 2019 with advanced recycling products via chemical recycling on the market to customers like Unilever and many others. And they clearly value those products. So we don't have any issue with generating a strong business case for the investment and technologies needed to deliver those products. What it requires is you take some risks, you take a step, you engage downstream and upstream to come up with the right kind of model. But it's very doable. And, we're in the process of scaling that technology in our site in Helene right now, and also in the works while scaling that to planning the next increment and scale. So, look, I think there's a clear value proposition when it comes to products. I think when you compare taking the waste back into energy, I think, although that's a viable path, and obviously we're engaged in areas like that too, I think you're going to see long-term more value proposition with it on the consumer and brand side, with putting those materials back into products as opposed to energy. But that'll remain to be seen. But we clearly see the opportunity. We're clearly participating in that market space, but it requires a whole different kind of collaboration. And then on the waste side, and I think Simon made this point, you have to drive change there by making it more costly to landfill than today, right? If we incentivize landfilling, then we're taking a high value resource with high energy content and allowing us to dispose of it in a way that provides no return at the end. So these are all things that we're very engaged in. We're founding members of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, very engaged across the value chain and trying to invest in waste infrastructure globally, but especially in the emerging geographies, because ensuring that we can get access to waste that can be effectively converted is essential. And the greater investment that we get on that infrastructure, the more economically effective the conversion of that waste is going to be. So, very aligned to the comments from the others here. It's a critical part of our strategy. It has a more direct impact on our scope 3, but in terms of a business focus and priority, it's at the top for us.
Thank you very much, Bob. Bryan, the circularity and one man's waste is another man's raw material. The answer is out there somewhere.
Yeah, and I think it's, we've talked about circularity a number of ways here. I mean, in my mind, conceptually, it goes down to what I'd call the short cycle and the long cycle for circularity, right? The short cycle is exactly that, transformation of waste back into raw materials, where the long cycle is CO2 released to the environment, then being recaptured and then brought back into the energy chain. So if you think about things like renewable fuels from vegetable oils, a very long cycle approach to circularity. CO2 gets released into the environment. It's also ultimately captured and brought back in to a complete cycle. I think these technologies exist. They're practiced today. There's actually a few 100,000 barrels of renewable feedstocks through like renewable diesel, renewable jet in operation today. Opportunity for a lot more of that. But this is a place where technology really has a play to find more feedstocks and more efficient ways to sort of bring that long cycle back from the CO2 that gets released into the environment, bring it back to the fuels or chemicals at the front end. I think what we talked about in more the question of one man's waste is another man's fuel is more about this short cycle circularity as I would look at it. And certainly there's a technology play there, but it's much more of a societal and behavioral play. We've seen today that when there's the will and when there's the economics to have a circular economy around plastics, it exists. PET is maybe one of the most notable examples, especially mechanically, one of the more readily recycled plastics. There's good demand for that. There's good opportunity. Clearly, recycle rates can go up, but for years and years and years, there's been a strong industry around mechanical recycle of PET. It's really societal behavior, getting recycling rates up and meeting society's demand for those circular plastics, for instance, that I think are really the only thing holding us back. Technologies exist, whether they're mechanical, whether they're advanced technologies that involve chemical recycling, they exist, they'll get better over time, but certainly the petrochemical industry is very focused on those. Next steps are really driving behavior. Bob mentioned Alliance to End Plastic Waste. There's an industry organization that was created really to help drive societal behavior to make sure that plastics don't get released to the environment and that they can become part of that circularity chain. And I think that's the big step. Whatever type of waste we're generating, we need to make sure that it's not released into that long cycle where it becomes either a problem because it's a waste that's harming other aspects of the environment, or it's ultimately released as CO2 in the environment. So getting a lot of that waste back into shorter recycle chains where it can be recycled directly, and then tackling those challenges as technologies are available to do it in a cost and energy efficient way, I think are really the keys to making a circular society really sustainable.
Bryan, thank you very much. That's a great segue because unfortunately, and much to my unamusement, we've reached the end of our allotted time. Could I be rude enough to go around each of the panel and ask you in the space of 20 seconds just to drop the mic with the takeaway message, please? It's just not forgetting we're going to deliver the circular economy, more sustainability and reducing emissions. Could we just start with Nicola, please?
Yeah, I think my two key messages would be, in the short term, get on and implement the energy efficiency solutions that make business sense now and will still make business sense in 5-10 years time. Don't wait for your 2030 targets, implement them now. And collaboration, open collaboration with your neighbours. So they're my two key messages.
Thanks, Nicola. I think Nike may have captured the do it now principle. Simon.
Yeah, so big challenges, don't need me to go through them. The industry faces big challenges, but equally brilliant opportunities, decarbonisation, sustainability and circularity. And my final point really is I'm actually pretty optimistic because the refining industry has shown before it can adapt and build resilience into the business.
Thank you. Chris?
I guess I'd put it this way. There's a perception that fossil resources are wrong. They're not. What's wrong is emitting CO2 from them. So, and I think our refineries, our petrochem industries have the skills and capabilities to actually lead the way in that, whether it's changing those scope 1 or 2 emissions by efficiencies, whether it's changing the feedstocks, or whether it's providing new products to the market that's low carbon.
Thank you. Bryan?
I think from my perspective, well, I don't want to trivialize the challenge. I think that technology solutions are available today to make a considerable short-term improvement in sustainability. And I think, companies like ours are, anxious to work with people looking to reduce their CO2 footprint. And I think we can surprise a lot of folks out there with how achievable some of those first steps really can be.
Fantastic. And Bob.
Yeah. I'll just end with a few quick comments. I mean, I think if I were to put down the three priorities, right, from my perspective, it's a focus on investment and innovation. It's a focus on collaboration, is all I've said here, and I'll just end with it. It's a focus on risk taking. We're going to have to make investments on technologies and capabilities that we're going to apply in 2030 to 2050 without fully understanding how we're going to do that, right? And at the end of the day, if we wait till the perfect solution exists to implement, we're never going to act. So I think from a cultural perspective, we have to embrace it that way. And by the way, financial markets and investors have to embrace it that way. And if I could just end on an upbeat note, because I think as Bryan said, there is a path to delivering against these solutions. There's also a huge opportunity here. We sometimes get caught up in the journey to decarbonize without recognizing that for our industries, whether it be in refining or petrochemicals, there's going to be a huge need for new materials to improve performance of solar, of wind, of EV and automotive. These are material plays that are direct value out of our industry. And by the way, the transitions won't happen without them. So, although we should be focused on the challenge with decarbonization, recognize that if we do this and the companies that do it well and bring the right solutions to the market, they're going to be the companies that lead us through the transition. So I do see it as more optimistic, maybe because I'm an R&D guy like Bryan, and I'm excited by the fact that it creates opportunities for us. But there is a real opportunity to make society a better place and to enable this transition. So, let's focus on the challenge, but also the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And can I just conclude by saying on behalf of the audience to the panel, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. It's been absolutely riveting from my perspective. My only disappointment is we haven't got the second bottle of wine to continue with, because this conversation will run and run. I think we're all agreed that the challenge is with us. There are opportunities, and the answer is now. On behalf of everyone, thank you very much for your time, your answers, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.